Hello there. This is Springfield Quay in the centre of Glasgow. One of a number of quays that used to run along the side of the River Clyde. I say used to because it's not really a quay now. There's no boats come up this far. Apart from anything else, there's a few bridges in the way. During construction of this quay in the 1840s, a number of ancient canoes were uncovered. I think when you have a bit of water, a river, throughout time people are always going to want to go over that water, more so if they can see land on the other side of it. And long ago, before we could figure out how to build bridges, we simply knocked lumps out of tree trunks and used that to get ourselves over the water. Around 50 of these ancient canoes have been found in various locations around the River Clyde, never too far from the water. And while I'm not suggesting for one moment that they were all built here, because a few of them might simply have been paddled upriver from somewhere else, but I think it's fair to say that in all probability we've been building boats and ships on the River Clyde for literally thousands of years. In those ancient prehistoric days, it was fairly easy to paddle your canoe across the River Clyde up here in the area of Glasgow. The river was very shallow. In fact, so shallow that in a number of places at low tide you could walk across it. Merchants in Glasgow who were importing and exporting goods couldn't get their ships up into the city and had to use places in the Firth of Clyde, like Port Glasgow, which, as the name suggests, was Glasgow's port in the 1690s. The merchants had to use Port Glasgow and somehow get their goods there and back before getting them on a decent sized ship. So, something had to be done there. And a number of eminent engineers, including Thomas Telford, were tasked with fixing the problem. And towards the end of the 18th century and the very beginning of the 19th century, they come up with a number of things, and over a period of time they built jetties out into the river and then filled in the river between those jetties, effectively creating quays, you might say, but then later on actually making quays that ships could dock at. And this had the effect of narrowing the river and so increasing the flow of water, which in itself would probably have helped to scour out some of the silt and muck that lay at the foot of the river and allowed it to get a little bit deeper. But in addition to that, they also started dredging the river. And the combination of these two things, it really helped to deepen the depth of the water and eventually allowed larger ships, at least in a high tide situation, to flow right into the centre of Glasgow. This was a great improvement. Merchants were just obviously overjoyed at the ease with which they could now export and import goods. And this sort of ease and the fact that Glasgow was really growing rapidly as part of the Industrial Revolution, there was a great increase in stuff to import and export, and merchants found that they needed more ships. And it is round about this period right at the beginning of the 19th century that shipbuilding in the upper reaches of the Clyde really took off. In those early days of shipbuilding in the Clyde, and we're talking the early 19th century, a few of the shipyards were sort of grouped together, you might say, or at least built in certain kind of areas quite close together. Apart from, I mean, in the early days, I think you had a shipyard at Mavis Bank Quay, which was just west of Springfield Quay, where we started off the video. You had another lone shipyard at Stob Cross, just where the Finison Crane is just now. You had yet another one at, I think it was called the Kelvin Haw shipyard, which is roughly where the entrance to Queen's Dock used to be, and the clock tower of the current Clydeside distillery. But there was a group of them just here, which is where the River Kelvin meets the River Clyde. And there was probably a good reason for that. I think that the amount of water that sometimes comes down the River Kelvin, that in itself would probably have helped to scour out some of the silt that might have built up at the foot of the river, so you get a bit more water depth. And also with the mouth of the Kelvin, at this area you've got a little bit more room for manoeuvring ships around after they've been launched. And I think that's probably why you had a number of shipyards right here. At the mouth of the Kelvin you had the Meadowside shipyard and the Point House shipyard. And directly across the river in Govan, you had about 4 shipyards at one time that went under a variety of names. You know, a lot of these shipyards changed owners over the years, and some of them even changed names, and it can be a little difficult trying to get a handle on exactly what was going on. But at least at one particular period of time you had Govan. One of the shipyards was called Govan Old Shipyard. Then you had Middleton Shipyard, Govan New Shipyard, and there was another one on the other side of Water Row. These all in 1912 come under the Harland and Wolff umbrella. Then still in Govan and a little bit further west you obviously had Fairfield Shipyard, and then a little further along Stevens Linthouse Shipyard. And on this side of the River Clyde, just opposite the Linthouse shipyard, you had again a sort of group of shipyards that went under, as I say, a variety of names. From here you had the Clydeholm shipyard, then a couple that variously went under names like Scotstoun Shipyard and White Inn Shipyard, and then another one, some of them were just called a shipbuilding yard. Further along towards the west you had the Blythewood Shipbuilding Yard, and then Yarrows. And obviously way beyond that you had John Brown's and Clydebank and Beardmore and Dalmuir. And I'll show you a satellite image just now, that the little kind of red dots showing the location of all of these shipyards. That gives you a good idea of just exactly how many there were in this section of the River Clyde.
You can get a good idea of how some of those early shipyards looked by examining a combination of old maps and paintings. This 1856 map shows the yard at Stob Cross, owned by John Barclay, later to become part of Barclay Curl and Company from 1818. You can see a couple of buildings, a basin, probably used to fit out and finish ships after being launched, and 2 slipways. This yard was located right where the finishing crane is now. We can see more detail in a painting by William Simpson dating to 1845, and another by an unknown artist which shows the launch of a ship from the yard in the 1830s. Barclay Curl and Company later, in 1855, opened the Clyde Home shipbuilding yard in Whiteinch.
Well, I've just kind of wandered in here to a bit of spare ground, and I come across this. I can never remember what you call these. Obviously they were used to tie ships up to a quay. Anyone know what these are called? To be honest, you see quite a lot of them when you go walking alongside the River Clyde. This one's got a slightly different shape to it, and there's part of me thinking it could be a little bit older than some of the ones that you generally see along the side of the River Clyde. And here's a bit of stone here as well. If you've been watching my videos, you know that I can get a bit excited about stones. I'm more excited about this one because it's shaped. There's a wee bit of carving there, and I'm no doubt that it once formed part of a building. This was once the Meadowside shipyard, just where the River Kelvin meets the River Clyde. Like most shipyards, it went under a variety of owners over the years. Some shipyards even changed their name as time went by. I think this one's always been known as the Meadowside Shipyard. I think this probably, and I'll check a map when I get back home. In fact, I'm going to show you a map shortly, you'll be able to see for yourself, but I think this probably sat at the side of a basin in the shipyard, where there's, you know, after a ship's launch they would have perhaps brought it to the basin to be finished and fitted out and such like. The shipyard's offices used to be just there, and the offices of a shipyard were often very grand, opulent affairs. And if you visit what was once the offices of Fairfield's shipyard just on the other side of the Clyde there in Govan, you'll see exactly what I mean by that. Absolutely stunning building, both inside and out. It's now the Fairfield Heritage Centre, and you can go in and see for yourself. Worth a visit. Yeah, I think it made a lot of sense to have your shipyard offices looking good. Maybe it created a good impression for people who were thinking about placing an order with you for a ship or two. The Meadowside shipyard offices, I think there's a video kicking about that once showed the inside of the building after the shipyard had closed. I think the offices were in a state of dereliction, but you could still get a little bit of a hint of the grandness that was once there inside the building. I took a photograph of the offices in around about 2011, which I'll show you shortly. A photograph of the outside of the building. Not long before it strangely caught fire and had to be demolished. Unfortunately, like a lot of Glasgow's old buildings, they seem to catch fire. And the strange thing is that in building the student accommodation here, as part of the complex, they have recreated the shipyard offices. Not inside, but externally. When you look at the structure, it looks almost the exact same as the shipyard offices used to be. You know, same size and shape. I'll show you images in the moment, you can compare them for yourself. And instead of marvelling at what they've done here and thinking, isn't that great, they've recreated the old shipyard offices, I just look at it and feel a great sadness. But I think I'll show you a variety of images just now, including maps, where you can perhaps get an idea of the layout of the Meadowside shipyard and perhaps some of the buildings and structures that are around about it. Oh yeah, my bum's wet. Right.
Todd and McGregor had this yard in 1845, and it was sold to D&W Henderson in 1873. It then changed hands in 1917 to Harland and Wolff, a Belfast firm who bought up a lot of yards around the First World War. The last ship launched here was in 1935. This photo, dating to the 1890s, was taken from the other side of the River Clyde and shows slipways in D&W Henderson's yard on the left and A&J Inglis Point House shipyard on the right, the latter being acquired by the firm in 1862 and so not shown on the previous map. The Point House shipyard was seemingly founded by Thomas B. Sneath in 1842, but there is no sign of it on that previous 1858 map. Of course, aerial photographs can sometimes give us a perfect view of the layout of some of these shipyards. This 1947 photo shows many things. You can see slipways of the Meadowside yard in the bottom left, the Point House yard on the other side of the River Kelvin, Yorkhill Quay's West Basin, Yorkhill Quay itself, its East Basin, and the entrance to Queen's Dock. Recognise the clock tower? On the other side of the River Clyde you have Govan Graving Dock and shipyards owned at that time by Harland and Wolff.
I'm in Govan, directly across the River Clyde from where the River Kelvin meets the River Clyde. And in the early days of shipbuilding in the first half of the 19th century, there was 3 yards grouped together here. I mean, there was actually 4. There was another one on the other side of Water Row, but as I've probably said a few times, most of these shipyards changed owners over the years, and at times they also changed their names. If you look at the first edition Ordnance Survey map dating to 1857, the 3 shipyards here are at that point called, the one on the east side of the group was called Govan East Iron Shipbuilding Yard. The one in the middle was called the Middleton Iron Shipbuilding Yard, and the one on the west side of the group, I think at that time it was just called a shipbuilding yard, although it was obviously owned by somebody. And over the years, these yards were owned by some pretty famous shipbuilders. For example, Robert Napier had a shipyard here from 1842, I think it was, and he is known as the the father of Clyde Shipbuilding, given his input in a number of ships that he built, and he even designed and built ship engines at a time when they were making iron steamboats. And I think he also got the first ever order in this area from the Admiralty for a ship for the Royal Navy. I think it was some sort of gunboat called the Bloodhound, which is a great name. And also in this group of 3 shipyards, another famous shipbuilder was James and George Thompson. And they built their first ship here, I think it was in the 1850s. Again, I think it was an iron steamboat called the Vulcan. Another great name. J&G Thompson, as a shipbuilding company, grew pretty rapidly. And decided they had to move away from this location and find a bigger spot on the river. They opted to move across the River Clyde further west to an area of land that didn't really have a great deal on it. I think there was just a farm or a farm or two. And in the 1870s they moved all their stuff to that location and just gradually created a bigger and a better shipyard so that they could build more ships and deal with more orders. And I think it was 1882 they decided to name that area Clyde Bank. That's how modern or how young Clyde Bank is. But in 1912 all these 3, in fact the 4 shipyards were taken over by Harland and Wolff, and I think they lasted until 1963 when they were all closed down.
The number of ships launched from Upper Clyde's shipyards is really quite astonishing. It was slow, gradual growth from the early 19th century. Between 1846 and 1852, 247 steam vessels were built. The tonnage of ships launched grew from 36,000 in 1859 to 341,000 in 1881. In the First World War alone, 481 warships were built here, and all in all, the total number of ships ever built on the Clyde probably tops 30,000. Things didn't always go to plan. When the Daphne was launched from Stevens Linthouse Yard in 1883, she hit the water and rolled over, trapping many men and boys inside, 124 of whom died. Early photographs of the tragedy show just how shallow the river was. Of course, you don't necessarily need deep water to launch a ship. It very much depends on the type of ship. Some ships were built and launched in the Forth and Clyde Canal. But the depth of water in the River Clyde was definitely an issue. And while clearly we launched many ships successfully, some larger ships, like the Queen Mary, found themselves temporarily grounded in water that just wasn't deep enough. The maximum depth at the point where the Daphne capsized, from a chart dating to 1846, was 12 feet.
Shipbuilding in the Upper Clyde has been a bit of a roller coaster over the years. There's been periods where a lot of ships have been built, and periods where the amount of ships being built has just kind of fallen through the floor, and shipyards have struggled. At times the industry has tried to help itself, and in 1930 the National Shipbuilder Security was formed, which was essentially an organisation that was intended to make the industry leaner and more competitive. And it did this by closing shipyards down. In fact, one of the first shipyards that closed down in its first year of operation was William Beardmore and Company's yard in Dalmuir, which had only been constructed or opened as a yard in 1906, and at that time it was a really modern bit of kit, for want of a better phrase. And then later, in the second half of the 20th century, in 1967, the Upper Clyde Shipbuilders was formed. And again, it was an amalgamation of a number of the larger shipyards, and it was designed to make the whole industry leaner and more competitive. And we had to be competitive because at the time we perhaps didn't notice that other countries were really getting their act together, and shipbuilding was taking off in other countries, in particular in likes of Japan, where they were going through a huge modernisation programme and really getting their act together and taking business away from us. I suppose you might say we took our eye off the ball in that respect, although some people would argue that we didn't, and it didn't make a great deal of difference. But there is no doubt that shipyards in other countries were getting their act together, and they were being supported by their government. That wasn't always the case here. Just 4 years after the Upper Clyde Shipbuilders was formed, it collapsed. And at that time, the Conservative government under the Prime Minister Edward Heath it simply didn't want to help them out. They effectively said, just get on with it. You know, this was at a time, as I say, when shipyards in other countries were being supported by their government. And building a ship's a costly affair. You might get a lot of money for the ship when it's finished, but up until that point, you're out a lot of money in order to buy the raw materials for building the ship, whether that's iron, steel or whatever. And you just need a little bit of money to tide you over between having to pay out all that money and getting paid for the full, complete ship. And I think at that time, Upper Clyde Shipbuilders was only wanting about £6 million alone, but the Conservative government said no. And that almost totally killed off shipbuilding in the Upper Clyde. It led to a work-in at a number of shipyards, and the famous words by Jimmy Reid: "We are not going to strike. We are taking over the yards because we refuse to accept that faceless men can make these decisions. We are not strikers. We are responsible people, and we will conduct ourselves with dignity and discipline." And as a result of those work-ins, where they simply continued working to finish off the ships, 2 shipyards were saved. So it's been a very rocky road for the Upper Clyde Shipbuilders over the years. We do still have 2 shipyards, Yarrow's, and Yarrow's also includes what used to be the Blytheswood, the shipbuilding yard, and we also have Fairfields and Govan, and both of these yards are under the umbrella of BAE Systems, and it's good to see that they're still in operation. Throughout time, on the River Clyde, we have endeavoured to keep the River Clyde deep enough to allow the passage of ships, whether engaged in trade or ships being launched. By 1900, there was 10 dredgers working constantly on the river, doing their best to scoop out all the debris and the muck that builds up at the foot or bed of a river in order to keep the river deep enough to allow all this activity to take place. I remember seeing dredgers in the 1960s, but I don't remember seeing any in recent years. I'm not sure, and I don't think we dredge the river anymore. And maybe that's significant. But we don't launch ships these days. Not in this section of the river. We seem to put them on low barges and sail them downriver to somewhere else where they can be finished off and launched, you might say, if that's the word. And we're not able, unlike countries like Japan, we're not able to construct huge ships, at least not in this part of the River Clyde. So we have taken to building big ships in sections and then putting those on low barges and sailing them downriver somewhere else where they are then stuck together with other bits of ships to make the end result a big ship. And that's a great shame because, you know, in the past, the launching of a ship was just a great affair. Invariably there was balloons and fireworks and a lot of whooping and hollering and hand clapping involved. And to think that that might not happen here anymore is, as I say, just a little bit sad. And perhaps the shallowness of the River Clyde has got something to do with that, although I don't really know. But if it has, then that brings me right back full circle to what I was talking about towards the beginning of the video. I'm Eddie Burns.